morning. My name is Halli Humphrey, and I am a sophomore here at the University of Science and Arts of Oklahoma, and we're just really excited to share our research project with you guys.
I'm Chelsea Fuston. I'm also a sophomore here at Science and Arts, and we are going to be discussing our research project, Democrats, They're Just as Bad, exploring unusual interactions between political affiliation and Christian nationalism. All right, so before we get started, we just want to go ahead and define Christian nationalism for everyone. Christian nationalism is the belief that the United States is and should be a Christian nation. That means, in their eyes, to be a good American is to be a Christian, period. Here we have some slide examples.
Yeah, so Christian nationalists would believe, are like really strong proponents that prayer should be a critical part of like the school day for like elementary and middle school and high school. So they don't really like the whole separation of church and state. They want to bring the two of them together, but they want the religion to be Christianity. Like they don't want anything else.
All right, so we'll just go ahead and define a few more terms for everyone. Conservative is just preserving traditional social institutions, trying to keep everything the same. Liberal is preserving and enhancing the right of the individual. Now, usually these are conflated with conservative meaning Republican, liberal meaning Democrat, but those are two different things entirely. So a Democrat is someone who believes in civil liberties and social equalities, and a Republican is someone who also wants to keep things the same, but they believe in free market economics. So they're really big fans of Adam Smith and capitalism and letting the system do its thing without a lot of government intervention. A good thing to note about political parties is they are just a coalition of many groups. All of those groups have different goals and different values, but they come together under the umbrella term Democrat versus the umbrella term of Republican. So the coalitions that make up the Democratic Party are racial minorities, women, environmentalists, union employees. The coalition that makes up the Republicans are people that serve in the military, high-level executives, and evangelicals.
For our data and methods, we did use the General Social Survey from the years 1996, 2004, and 2014. So we also used fully controlled multivariate binary logistic regressions, and then the results are used to derive predicted probabilities using two-way interactions between political affiliation and Christian nationalism. So essentially, instead of just having a Christian nationalist variable and then political affiliation, we combined the two so we could better understand what was exactly happening between like Democratic Christian nationalists and then versus like Republican Christian nationalists. For our methodology, we also filtered out people who were not white because people who are black or of other race tend to mess with the data a little bit. There's just some different reasonings behind their answers, so white people were just a solid blanket way to study it. Then we also weighted the data to better reflect the census. So some people don't choose to participate in the survey, so we wanted to go ahead and wait for the fact that some of them don't do it just because of personal reasons or whatever it may be.
Okay, so our independent variables, the things that we are studying, is Christian nationalism. We coded that as people who only answered very important, that Americans are also Christian. There was also a section that said important, neutral, not important at all. We only focused on the people who said yes, it was very important that Americans are also Christian. That kind of separates everyone else, and that's how we coded that variable. Political affiliation, that's also what we're studying. We already went over the definitions: Democrat, Republican, and independents.
So we are going to go into our graphs that we have ready for you guys. We did 6 different groupings, and we are going to go through each of them, and we have 2 graphs for each like category. So these graphs will show, we categorize them so you have religiously pluralistic Democrats versus Christian nationalist Democrats, and then the same is for independents and Republicans. So for gender, we have the predicted probability for agreeing that it's better for women to stay home while men work. And you can see that the Christian nationalist Democrats are way up there compared to the religiously pluralistic Democrats and even a bunch of the Republicans who are also Christian nationalists. So clearly there's a big difference and a defining factor between being religiously pluralistic and being a Christian nationalist. We also have the probability for agreeing that homosexual sex is wrong. All of the Christian nationalists are pretty high up there comparatively, but if we focus on the Democrats again, that's a big point difference just for them.
Okay, law and order. The predicted probability for favoring capital punishment, aka the death penalty. Typically, we imagine that Democrats are against this principle, but as you can see, Christian nationalist Democrats are even equal to the independent section. It is a little bit lower than the Republicans or even the independents as a large, but they are way more likely compared to other Democrats to say that they agree with the death penalty. Next we have favoring gun laws. Americans across the board are really proponents of stricter gun laws. So the Christian nationalist Democrats are way more likely to say that they should have more gun laws and gun permits, even comparatively to regular Democrats. Democrats as a whole lead this category, but Christian nationalist Democrats in particular are the most probable to say that we should have stricter gun laws.
Moving into nationalism, so we have the predicted probability for agreeing the rest of the world should be like the United States. So again, the Christian nationalist Democrats are way up there compared to the Republicans and the independents, and the religiously pluralistic Democrats are pretty far down there with the independents, and then there's a huge difference between the two of them. Then we also have the predicted probability of pride of the military, so just like encouraging the military and like wanting very proud of them, I guess. And you can see that the Christian nationalist Democrats are up there with the Republicans again. The religiously pluralistic Democrats are fairly even with the independents. So again, there's just a big difference there as well.
Nativism is the idea that you prefer people born in this country to immigrants. So before we jump into the slide, I just wanted to define that term. Christian nationalist Democrats are way more likely to say that immigrants take jobs away, even similar levels to Christian nationalist Republicans. The Republican Party as a whole, like I said, is pretty anti-immigration. So it's very interesting to see that the Democratic Party, or at least a section of the Democratic Party, also shares those same beliefs.
Next we have race. So we have the predicted probability for agreeing that the race gap is due to lack of will. So this is tied very closely to like the American dream, that you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You can do it if you have like the drive and the motivation. So they're essentially saying that the race gap is just due to them not wanting to, basically. So it's putting it solely on the individual and not as the institution as a whole. So we have Christian nationalist Democrats are up there almost at 70%, and that's again above the average for even the Republican Party as a whole. So next we have the probability for agreeing that blacks should work their way up without help. So again, this is taking the stance that race does not factor into how people climb the social ladder or anything like that. So it's saying that black people should not get any additional help, but it's not taking into account like the fact that society is kind of stacked against them. But again, you can see the Christian nationalists for each party are pretty high, but then the biggest difference is between the religiously pluralistic Democrats and the Christian nationalist Democrats again.
Okay, for this slide, I do just want to go ahead and remind you guys that we did filter out anyone that isn't white, so these are all white people. That's very important for this slide because black Christian nationalists in particular, their religion means something entirely different to white Christian nationalists. So white Christian nationalists agree that the Bible is the literal word of God. That means they read that, the Bible, as something that really happened and that God really said that. Some people read it as a metaphor, some people read it as a story. They read it as, nope, this is fact, and this is what God actually did and said. Christian nationalist Democrats are just as likely as Christian nationalist Republicans to agree with that sentiment, even like a little above them. Like Halli mentioned in the beginning, a good example of Christian nationalism is wanting prayer in schools. So it's not surprising that all of the Christian nationalists across the board are very likely to say that that should happen, that prayer belongs in schools. Christian nationalist Democrats, surprisingly, are the most likely out of all of the groups to say that prayer belongs in schools.
So why does this all matter? So basically in society we tend to, like we said, interchange the words liberal with Democrat and conservative with Republican. So we just want to show that you need to make sure that you know the definitions of both, because we don't want you to mix them up, because they do mean very different things. So we just need to be more careful with how we word things.
Also, I think we have a tendency to think that groups that we don't agree with are outside of our group. So I know a lot of people in the Democratic Party like to isolate Christian nationalism phenomenon as to the Republican Party and to the Republican Party only, when in fact 30% of Christian nationalists are Democrats. So there's actually a large portion of them that belong to their own party. They need to deal with that internal conflict, because we cannot dismiss this movement as outside of ourselves if some section of our own party is taking part in it.
So going with that point, we, in terms of political parties and even in church, we are more diverse than we think we are. So you can be sitting in a church that you feel is very like democratic, but then you'll have like conservatives sitting in the pews as well, and as well as like, and you would think, oh yeah, well because they're conservative, that means they're Republican, but they're not. And so you can just have liberals and conservatives within each party, and just I think we need to recognize that we have a little bit more diversity than we think we do.
In conclusion, Democrats are just as bad as Republicans in terms of not agreeing of separation of church and state and believing in the principles that is Christian nationalism. I hope you enjoyed our presentation.